Hey guys, welcome to the next episode of Let's Talk Agile podcast. And today I have a treat for you. So, if you've been developing for quite a while, you've probably noticed a trend where you start working on something and really struggle getting it done. And we all know the definitions of done, and we even know the definition of ready, that you're supposed to prep things before you get started. However, none of the information we have learned went to the extent that the two gentlemen right here in the podcast, Max Guernsey and Luniel de. These two gentlemen have created a book called Ready. And in this book, this is a wonderful book, all of the dysfunctions that we observe in engineering are actually stemming from what I've gathered after reading the book. Guys, welcome to the show. So, as we get started, I'd love to get an introduction. How'd you come up with the book? How'd you two guys meet?
Max, you want to go first?
Sure.
I have to think longer
Uh,
about mine.
Great. Well, we met when we were both consultants at a consulting firm called Net Objectives, which has since been bought by the PMI. Um, I am a software developer. I'm a software development skills coach. That's what I was when he met me. Obviously, before that, I was just a regular software developer. And he is an expert product guy. And so that's how we met. And then we've kind of been in each other's orbit and eventually went into business with each other. And we had this kind of tipping point moment, which we described in the beginning of the book, by the way, where we were working with a client that was just really struggling. They thought they knew what the solutions were. They brought us in to do those solutions. I was brought in for technical reasons and went through. They wanted me to review the code. I reviewed the code and I gave them, frankly, I gave them a report that I thought was scathing because it said things like, you have this exact same 20-line code block copied 71 times. You should put that in a function and call it. That was the level of detail. Like, there's no, you guys should look into the strategy pattern or whatever. It was clear that we were nowhere near talking about that kind of level of design. Anyway, I delivered this report thinking I was delivering just a scathing report of how bad the code quality was. And the response of the team was, "Oh my god, this is amazing. We should," and they did it. Like, it was like their eyes were opened to the idea of putting code in a function. They were that level of operator. And of course everything we tried didn't work until Luniel said, "Let's try this other thing that I tried for another group that worked for them." Can I hand it off to you?
So, um, I, Max talked about me being a product person, and it's interesting because I started cutting my teeth on actually being a coder when I was still in my teens, but I think this story actually kind of carries through to what we have today. And I'll tell the story. It's a pattern that is repeated with me in developing solutions for clients. My first one for a paid client was a commercial software for a small company. It was when I was 16 years old. I was still in school at the time. I think I might have been one of the few people that actually owned a computer in South Africa at the time. Yeah, as school kids, right? But somewhere in the 20s, I had this one thing. I worked with a company who wanted me to develop a solution for them. And one of the things that I realized when I was doing that with them is I was doing the same thing I had been doing throughout my career up until that time. I was literally go in, sit down with a customer, and actually have them teach me their job. I would go and observe what they're doing. I would have them teach me how to do what they're doing. I would talk to the people on the ground who are suffering from the particular problems, etc. And then, I would figure out, okay, now how do we solve these? And, as a software developer, I could think of ways to solve their problems that they couldn't think of because, if you're not a software developer, you don't necessarily know how. What you can do, what software can do for you, and how those can be solved. And so instead of them telling me what the solution was that they wanted, I would try to figure out what's the real problem that they have and then say, okay, now here's what we can do to solve these problems. Unbeknownst to me, that was me cutting my teeth on the product side, the product discovery side, a little bit of the product design side as well, etc. But I did all of that solo throughout pretty much to the late 90s when I came out to the States. And I've since been dev manager and eventually moved into product, but I've worked with so many different teams, managed many different development teams, have played the role of scrum master and product owner and dev manager. I even did all three of those roles in the same job in places, right? And so early days when I learned about Scrum. But one of the things that kind of stood out for me throughout this was, yeah, there's Scrum, and there's what we were taught in the early 2000s, early 2000s, mid 2000s of what Scrum is, kind of this typical training, etc. And then there's the reality of what it actually takes to develop software. Right? And so what I found is there were a lot of people in the industry who were saying, well, Scrum says we got to do blah, blah, blah. We got to do this, that, and the other. I'm like, yeah, but what about these other things that we also have to do when we do software development? I don't know if you say, well, I need to come in and the software development team just needs to jump in and they need to start developing, then what are they developing? Do we actually even know what we're going to be developing? Does everybody know what we're going to be developing? And so even in those early days, there was this thing for me where I would end up pulling my stakeholders and several teams in together, and we would sit down for sometimes a day or two to actually talk through the problems, talk through the customer and the stakeholders' issues, and then come up with what the solution is that we should actually go and build. And then we would map that out and things like that. So there was this growing sense that not enough was being done within the industry to actually have developers set up for success. Right? It's like, okay, well, you're giving them some ticket that they need to go and run and go and implement, but do they actually talk to the customer? Do we sit down together and have a shared understanding of what the problems are, etc.? And so that's already kind of the seed. And I talk a little bit about that in my foreword in the book. Overall, I've seen these patterns occur. And what you see today, the three practices in there, are all responses to the problems that, the dozens and dozens of companies, as well as hundreds of teams that we've worked with over the years, have been experiencing. Understanding these are symptoms that you see, what are the actual root causes underneath that, and then solving those root causes. And so, in a nutshell, what led to what you see today in Ready. And it's not just about helping some of the most junior teams to succeed. It was very satisfying that we were able to do that, but it's also advanced teams that we've worked with, like really advanced teams that we've worked with, and we've seen these same patterns emerge, these same symptoms emerge. And for me, it's out of a desire to help the development teams actually succeed when so much in our industry is just throw stuff over to the development team. And if they don't get it right, then there's some whip that's going to be applied to them, right? Because they didn't get it right, but they were set up for success in the first place anyway. So how do we actually help those teams to succeed? So anyway, so that said, I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Luniel. Great story, guys. So for anybody watching, requirements maturity flow, if I'm naming it correctly, and that's described in the book as a unique process that you can roll out with your teams to get better quality of throughput of the deliverables. But I wanna take a sidestep a little bit here. How did you discover the patterns? And I know that you talk about it in the book, but what was the actual aha moment?
I don't think that there's any one particular aha moment, one particular event that was it for me. It was more a series of almost like peeling the layers of the onion, right? It's like, okay, so we've got this thing. How do we solve this problem? Like, okay, now we've solved this problem, but there's still something else. I peeled it further, right? And trying various different things throughout the career.
Let's dive into it a little bit. So, definition of ready, right? A lot of people know what it is. And then there's this concept of let's just start, right? Kent Beck, in his book, Extreme Programming, makes a case where there's a lot of times a lot of discussion about experimentation. And in a time where people talk about all these experiments, he makes a claim that, well, he could already complete at least two of them. Now, obviously, that's not the case in every scenario, but you make a really strong case that too many teams are starting before they're ready. But where do you draw that line between healthy readiness and sort of your analysis paralysis?
Well, Ready does not demand that you cannot do experimentation or that experimentation is bad. Right? In fact, as one of the things that we try to do is to help teams who are trying to do exactly that, trying to find is like do some experimentation, try to figure something out, is actually help them to be set up for success. Because if you have so many teams that I've worked with, I've seen this thing. It's like people get together and there's various ideas, and this little cohort in the team, these 2 or 3 people, they're going to go and try this thing, and then these people are going to try in this thing, and then you end up having this fracturing of just people trying stuff all over the place. But then when I sit there and I watch what they're doing, I bring them back and I say, what is it that you're actually trying to even do? Like, does everybody know where this train is even heading? Like, do we know why we're doing this experimentation? Is there a very clear understanding of that? So when we talk about ready, the first thing that we actually introduce there is just being able to get a shared understanding. Right? If your team does not have the team and your stakeholders, they do not have a shared understanding of what is being asked from them, or what it is that we're even trying to go after as a goal, then you just basically have people who have their own interpretations are going to go run off and do what they think is what should be done. And then the results from all of that ends up spinning. You end up having a spinning from that, because it's like, well, you did that, but that's not really helping us here. What were you really after? And then you ask them and they're like, well, we thought we meant this. And we're like, that's not at all what we're looking for. And so seeing that is really about, if there's one thing you can do, is before you just tell your team just to go and do something, is let's make sure we all actually understand what the goal here is. What is it that we're trying to do? Let's understand what the problems are, and let's understand why we're doing this, what the actual goal and the outcomes are for this. And I was just say that alone, just that little piece itself, is so fundamental. But I've seen so many teams struggle with that because they don't do that. They're dropped into a Scrum environment, if you will, right, or whatever the environment is that they dropped in, and there's so much pressure on just having to get started and having to do something, and so there's this, the result of that is just almost disarray, if you will.
Yeah, this reminds me of, the Scrum environments where I worked, where the typical sprint kickoff includes the grooming right inside, and you're being dumped all these things, expected to decompose it, and the meeting scheduled for half an hour runs like almost half a day because this is the first time the team is learning about what they have to deliver. Oh,
Exactly.
and even best, they have to deliver everything that very sprint, and they have to do all the investigation part of it. And obviously, when things don't go right in the end and the team barely delivers anything at all, then it's the team's fault. But ultimately, what just happened? Nobody was really ready to work on it.
They're set up for failure in that situation. I want to go back to the question you asked a second ago, though, because I have a slightly different angle I want to take on it that kind of speaks to the structure. That's where my mind goes, is structure. The reason why we made definition of ready be the last thing we talked about, well, one of the last things we talked about, instead of the first thing we talked about, is that even though it's first in the execution order, it logically it depends on the things before it. You need the time and space to do the proper analysis, right? And then you need a definition of done. So I'll give you an example. So for that team that we gave you that's like way on one end of the spectrum, they needed every single thing completely specced out. They needed Gherkin. They needed to talk about the Gherkin. They needed all of that. But we're doing some custom software for a buddy of ours. And with that, we don't, you know, we don't need all of that. So the way you avoid paralysis or analysis paralysis with the definition of ready is to understand that the definition of ready is about being ready to complete the definition of done to whatever standard of precision that definition of done is. So if you think about this, me doing work and Luniel doing work with our buddy, what we do is we go and we help him implement, help him use the software, and we have a conversation, and maybe in teams we type out a few bullet points, and that is our definition of ready for the next phase, the next block, right? Because we don't use Scrum, right? With 3 people, it doesn't really make sense to
Of course.
through all that.
So is it more subjective or is it really that strict and
It,
process oriented?
it's not that it's more subjective. It's that his that the definitions of done are open ended enough that it's okay if, a button is blue or white. It doesn't matter in that case, in that scenario. And so we don't spec it out. And because we don't spec it out, we don't have any readiness work in place to make it happen, if that makes sense. Right. So it's like, well, this is chef's choice. There's a bunch of stuff that's chef's choice. And it's explicitly chef's choice. They know they're gonna get whatever I choose the next time we look at the software, and it's okay with everyone to just see whatever I chose and then cycle another time. They'd rather do that than the analysis. That's way different from, um, you're going to choose an answer and then I'm going to tell you it's wrong, right? By being explicit, like just kind of as a working agreement, I get to make just implementation decisions, and then if they're not the right decision, we'll do it in another cycle. There's no room for someone to go back and say, well, you did that wrong, Max. I wanted it to be puce, and you chose white for that button color. Nobody can say that because there was no choice. It doesn't matter what somebody wanted. It's like, I wish every time I coughed, I ended up with a handful of diamonds that I could sell, but it doesn't happen, right? It doesn't matter.
I guess
Shit.
it depends on
Anyways,
what's the concept of material definition, right? You want to deliver based on the definition of done, that's material, but in material things, you can move on. There's things that you can do later, and nothing is critical. You want to get to the core because the smallest iterations, smallest fixes, they can be done next. So it's an evolutionary approach, right?
Yeah, it's what's
right.
really important that we need to get done now, right? What are the things that are going to make or break the outcome, make or break success? But I would also add to this thing with Max is like, talking about us working with a friend of ours. Max and I have internalized the principles. For us, there is just no other way for us to operate. And you can't say that we are slow, because if there's one thing we're not, it's slow. But because we've internalized this, we don't even have to think about it. This is just the way that we operate. We make sure that we're very clear up front. We have our conversations. We understand exactly what it is that we're going to go do. If there's something that Max needs from me that he needs because he can't go and do it without me, then I'm going to go and do that. I'm going to go and create that, and then we'll just sit down and we'll discuss that. And once that's ready, then okay, if he needs something that needs to be done by somebody else, or we're waiting for somebody else, or he needs to go do something else first, like go and do some research, he's definitely not ready to implement this thing that we want because he doesn't even really understand what it's going to take, if it's even feasible. So he has to go and do that research. So we're just very clear about, are we actually ready to move forward with the implementation, because we don't want to just go half-cocked and start with the implementation if we don't really know what we're doing, right? And so
Yeah.
it's that level.
It's like every framework, right? So like, I watch a lot of like videos of street fights, right? And when you see someone who's disciplined in a street fight, you never I've never seen um the same kind of like purity of form that I see on the mat of sparring. Right? It's like because they sparred and they did the form and they did all that, and then they internalized all the principles, and then someone clocks them in the chin, and what they do as a response doesn't look anything like what they did for training, but the training like sunk all the principles into their bones and resulted in the guy who started the fight ending up on the ground.
Yeah, it's sort of the purpose of a technique, right?
Right.
So if what's the point of a technique? Well, with a proper technique, your chances of success increase,
Yep.
right? But so I have a question, and I guess you make a lot of reference to teams starting without actually being ready, which makes a lot of sense. But what I found missing in the book was references to spikes in Scrum. So, for example, I had an experience where I temporarily stepped into a team and I made it the best team from the worst team in about 3 months. And one of the things I did is I told them exactly that. Don't start anything you're not ready. And what you should do is you should pick up the spikes one sprint, get your things in order, And then the next sprint, you could actually know what you have to implement. So it's very similar to the dual track process of readiness and delivery that you guys are proposing. And it worked very, very well, except I needed to make a change. The spikes had to come with a deliverable. That deliverable either had to be a document that explains pros and cons and alternatives, something that we could pick as a solution, or an architecture or a design or a user-centric experience, markup of some sort. And that was the basis of the alignment on the team regarding what it needed to be built. Without that, the entire process fell apart.
Talk about the spike for us. If you see what we talked about in the book with regards to what we call readiness work items, right? Now, a spike is not actually something that's formally part of Scrum. It is a practice that has been adopted by people who use Scrum for software development. There's no even mention of the word spike within the Scrum guide itself, but it's a common practice. And as you said, it's a I think in a past conversation, it was like a spike essentially is a time box. It is something that you want to go and do, but it's something you want to go do because you're not ready to do this other thing. So you need to go and, either you need to go and do some research, or you need to go and do some prototyping, or the classic definition that I've seen of a spike is just drive this thin little thing throughout the system so we can even see if it's feasible or viable or whatever it is, right? And the point behind that is it is a type of readiness work that you're going to do. And so what we did with this is saying, we're not going to tell you that it has to be a spike or it has to be this or the other. All these types of activities are types of readiness activities. There are essentially things that you want to go and do that are attempts at getting you to a point of where you really are ready to go and implement what you need to do, right? And the thing about that is that it's often, in fact, most of the times, it's impossible to estimate it, because you don't really know what it's going to take to go and do the research. You don't know where this rabbit hole is going to take you, right? Or what you're going to cover. You just there's this classic thing that in Scrum, well, you've got to estimate, you've got to put an estimate, or else you shouldn't be doing it. Well, the point is not that in Scrum. The point is that you've got a finite amount of capacity in your sprint, and you need to be very clear as a product owner, how much of that capacity are you carving out to go and do what work? And so instead of saying, well, you've got to estimate it and you have to be accurate with the estimate, let's say, okay, well, we're going to go do this. And if I say I've got out of 100%, I'm willing as a product owner, because I have fiduciary responsibility to the organization of what I have the team work on. Well, I'm actually going to use some of this team's capacity, or let the team use some of their capacity to actually do this. But at the same time, maybe we have some other things that we need to do as well. So all we're doing is we're saying, you have some readiness work that you need to do. Let's do that. You have a spike you want to go and do? Great, that's a readiness work item. Right? And we are very clear about what the end result is that you're looking for. Right? But even though you say there has to be something that comes out at the end, like documentation or maybe a demo or something like that, maybe some kind of a proof of concept, that's what you're working towards. But maybe your time box didn't allow you to actually achieve that. There's still open end. So, but you have to be able to report something, some progress to that and some findings. So it's not just this open-ended thing. So you've done this. So now we're going to have to talk at the end about what it is that you actually accomplished. And do we need more time? Do you need to carve out more time to do that? Maybe this sprint, maybe the next sprint. What is it? So we're very clear on what it is. It's not just this free-for-all, just open-ended thing that we do, right? And in the end, it all comes down to making that work visible and clear, and being able to make trade-offs between that and other work that we do. Because if you end up saying, well, we have had a time box of 10% of the sprint capacity, well, what happens when you hit that time box limit and you're not done? Well, what ends up happening a lot of times I've seen with teams is they just keep going and they don't stop. Like, hang on for a second. We're only supposed to use this much. You need to stop because there's other things that we also need to accomplish, right? So don't go beyond that. So it's just a mechanism for teams to be able to to understand how they're using the capacity, what their commitments are, but it's not in any way meant to prevent them from doing things such as spikes.
Understood. So basically, it's you're not tying the readiness aspect to any specific practice. That's why you didn't talk about spikes,
Correct.
because that's just another way of achieving it.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Max, what's your take on this?
I mean, basically, he hit all the points, right? There's a category of work that's fundamentally inestimable, right? You cannot know how long it is. And the only rational approach to something that is fundamentally inestimable is to say we're going to try to do some of it, see if we get it done, and eventually maybe we'll have an estimate. And we're just going to keep taking slices of it until we either decide we're not going to pursue that avenue anymore, or we're done, or we know how long it's going to take us to get it done, right? And so that's really what readiness work is there to do. Is the analysis is, to me, the obvious thing, right? You've for some teams in some environments, like regulated environments, and maybe, like, like I said, the not top level teams, you need to do a lot of analysis. I mean, I would argue that for some of those teams, analysis is more than half the work, and the coding and all of that is maybe less than a quarter. And then there's other stuff, right? But then even just non-analysis, right? So refactoring. We've got this legacy system. We've let it go too long. Yeah, maybe we have tests, and so by some standard we call it not legacy, but it's still something everyone's afraid to touch. We need to transform its design, but we don't really know how long it's going to take to get from our current design to that design. Well, we know we can work in little slices. We know we can refactor in 5-minute increments, right? And so we can say we're going to take half a day worth of time this sprint and dedicate it to the task of working towards this transformation, right? And we just keep doing that until the transformation is done and the impediment is gone. I mean, it can be applied to anything, right? So you could say, I need this story done, but this story really shouldn't be done with the design as it is. So I'm going to take this big design transition and break it up into readiness PBIs and keep doing readiness PBIs until the design impediment is out of the way. Then I can do the story the right way without introducing technical debt. And I've actually gotten rid of technical debt in the process, right? So it's just anything that is inestimable and needs to be done before you do a story the right way in accordance with the covenant between business and engineering kind of fits in that box.
If I can add something to that, if I may. It serves not just the team, but it also serves the product owners and stakeholders. It serves both sides of that equation, right? So as Max mentioned, some of the stuff the team might do, like for instance, we might say, okay, we're going to go and implement this thing, but we actually have to prepare the system to implement that. So refactoring is maybe something that we need to do, but we don't know what it's going to take to refactor this, how long it's going to take, etc. Because we have to go in there and go and refactor the system. So refactoring would be the type of readiness work that a team would actually request and take on in order for them to say, okay, now the system is ready and we can actually go and implement this thing that you've asked us to implement per what we understand in the design we want to take on. But at the same time, if I'm playing the role of product owner or capability manager or something like that, and I'm doing things like behavior-driven development, and I'm actually responsible for writing such requirements, I might have to spend many hours with the team to actually review the specifications, review the design, maybe the visual design with them and with my stakeholders, etc., to actually go through and make sure that everybody has this understanding, and we have to refine, for instance, refine the specification to a point of where everybody agrees that this is exactly what's being asked for. This is complete. We're not going to end up having something that's broken at the end because we missed something critical on that. We have what we need, so we can actually go and implement that. Well, that's going to take time of the team. I need to be able to reserve some of that time from the team. Well, how do I do that? Well, I do that through some time box activity. I don't just randomly do it and pull them into meetings because the only thing that's on their sprint is development stories, right? No, I need to have a mechanism to actually show that this team was busy. Why did they only deliver? If you only did the developments velocity, right? Well, with this sprint they delivered 20 story points of velocity. Well, the next sprint it was 30, and then this sprint, the next one was only 15, and then you've got like, why only 15? Like, well, we've had all this other stuff to do and this stuff to do,
Yeah.
but it was not represented anywhere. So it's like, all right, that's
Yeah.
not. Go ahead.
So visibility is a huge problem. And if you're sitting in a leadership seat, you are completely oblivious to all the things that the teams are involved with.
Exactly.
And I actually liked what Max said about the fact that analysis is a huge chunk of work. That's true. For some reason, when we switched from waterfall to agile, we said no analysis needs to take place. And that is a huge problem. Forces in physics do not disappear. Right? They get shifted. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if you are front loading and doing some analysis work, that means you can accelerate the delivery. But if you're not doing that, you're going to be paying the cost later on by churn. Churn in the form of defects, churn in the form of we can't finish it because we're getting stuck, because we didn't really understand, or even worse, as you mentioned in the book, the rewrite. It's the most expensive form of churn. But I want to switch gears here a little bit. So you brought up this very, very bad V word, velocity. And velocity and the dysfunction is well documented. And guys, just if you're watching this video, please, please, please educate yourself where the pitfalls are. You can use it somewhat marginally successful, but this isn't 2005 anymore, so you got to get past that. But in the book, what I found, I'm sorry?
Or 92.
Yeah, but in the book, I didn't see the direct critique. It almost looked like you were avoiding critiquing velocity and its dysfunction. So I have a question. Do you think poor readiness is often the downstream effect of teams chasing velocity?
Velocity's dysfunction comes from the fact that it's not really velocity in the first place. It's called velocity, and that's what it shares with the concept of velocity. So in real life, velocity is a speed and a direction. That's in real life. And in the highly reductionistic, basically spreadsheet driven world of project management where velocity dysfunction breeds, what we end up looking at is the speed component only. And it's not even the speed component, it's like a speed component of like one dimension that's not really even a very important dimension. And we ignore the part of velocity that actually would matter because it's hard to model. This happens in business all the time, right? You say, well, that's not the thing you want. Why aren't you tracking the thing you want? And they go, well, the thing I want is hard to model, right? The part of velocity that matters is the direction component. And since we're working with software, which is a high leverage production activity, right? You build a thing and then yes, you have to maintain it after that, but basically you can use it hundreds, thousands, millions, billions of times for the time you spent building the code, right? So just knowing that you're aimed at the business outcome would be valuable. I wouldn't care what the speed is so long as it's more than zero or really not less than zero, right? If I knew I was aimed at the goal and I knew I was moving, then I would say that version of velocity would be really, really, really valuable if we could get people to use it. And that tracks the physics concept of velocity, right? But this chasing numbers, chasing spreadsheet values, chasing some imaginary model about some imaginary count of some imaginary unit that ends up getting called the velocity has led to many, many, many maladies and probably, yeah, is a contributing factor to poor readiness.
Thanks for giving me some time to think, Max. I do have a few things to say on that as well, if we still have time.
Absolutely. No, we got time. We got time. If you guys have time, I have time.
I honestly don't think that most teams development teams. If we talk about the Scrum team, has, they have the three roles, right? You've got your product owner, you've got your Scrum master, and then you've got your development team in the Scrum. I don't think most development teams truly are chasing velocity. I think it's other people who are trying to get
They're
them to
running from a
chase
whip.
velocity. And I think it's this fascination with numbers. It's a fascination with control. I see this a lot where, especially in companies where they're still very much project management minded, right? Because project management, Gantt charts and everything is all about tracking progress to this thing that we think, because we were able to establish the entire project plan up front, that this is, we could just tick it off and just make this beautiful progress towards it. Well, the reality in software development is completely different. It's different from other types of places where project management really truly works in terms of that type of thing, right? But if you go back to, you understand where velocity, the idea of velocity even came from, right? I mean, Jeff Sutherland talks about that originally when he was talking to the person who wanted him to do Gantt charts. And he's like saying, well, Gantt charts, they just, you create a Gantt chart and then the next day it's completely irrelevant. So how about we actually try to deliver some working software and see how this tracks against the overall deliverable, and try to get an understanding of, are we on track towards a particular date based off of this, kind of almost an average burn down of this backlog and this progress towards that, right? And the backlog itself may ebb and flow as we continue to develop, but at least it kind of gives you at that very high level some kind of a trend to know where are we heading with this average velocity, based on yesterday's weather or whatever it was, right? Using those terms. But also understanding that things change and we might discover that there's more to do. And so now we need to have those conversations. But it's when there's this almost this dogmatic insistence on tracking velocity the way that it's being tracked, it's counterproductive in my opinion. Anyway, so
Agreed.
it's not understanding what the intent behind that was, what the purpose behind that was. I think that leads a lot of implementations of it completely astray.
I really like what Max said about the velocity being the speed and direction.
Yeah.
I almost want to say that we got the speed down right. That's sort of your effort, but the direction is the readiness. Because if you don't have the clarity, where are you even going to? What's your direction? So the readiness is the direction, if you think about it. That's the secret sauce. And I think maybe that's what we've been missing all these years. We didn't really give it the serious thought. We kind of pushed off the analysis to the side. We said we'll figure things out on the fly. And when everything becomes an experiment, then you're allowed to fail because there is nothing really that you're vouching for. And so it created this weird culture where people are busy, but there are no specific accountabilities. And then the big companies came about and said, no, 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 the accountability is here. So we're going to measure you with your outputs now, because that's the only way that they could project sort of the progress, right?
I have an analogy that I sometimes use with teams. Imagine you have a cat that has to go from point A to point B, and the cat starts running, and somewhere in between it just starts chasing its tail. Well, at that point in time, its velocity towards the goal essentially is, I mean, it's still directional, right? But it's just in a circular moment. It's not actually making any progress towards where the actual goal is. So, it's definitely got some speed there, but in
Yeah,
the grand
yeah.
scheme, its velocity is zero.
Yeah, and that actually happens when teams are in a self-discovery mode, right? They would make some progress, get stuck because they discovered something, and now they're spinning wheels because they're not really clear. And the velocity says they're making progress, but not anything is getting done where you can actually get to your goals. One area in the book that I kind of disagreed with and quite a bit is the task decomposition debate. So you push back on the task decomposition as a readiness requirement. And I've actually had a completely opposite experience. I think task decomposition is critical for two reasons. Number one, it's a really, really good engineering discipline. If the engineer cannot decompose the work, it's immediately a red flag. They don't know how to get it done, and it's impossible to measure their progress because as different tasks complete, you can estimate about what's remaining. You can actually take a look. Oh, okay, you've done these APIs. We have only one API remaining, right? So it gives you at least a little bit more thorough details in progress. Also, if you're having a discussion of requirements before you start something, if you force the task decomposition and make it into your readiness, it almost fits nicely into the definition of done because that maps out the things you have to do with what needs to be checked off in the end. That's the way I viewed it, but you guys actually say an opposite, the task
Not well. I don't think we
decomposition.
say it as opposite as you think. So first of all, the section that you're talking about, I'm pretty sure, is the part where we're talking about what is and what is not canonical Scrum. And so what we said was it is not part of canonical Scrum, and it isn't, right? And just like test-driven development is not, that doesn't make it good or bad or anything. It just means it is not a part of Scrum. It's a different thing that you do, perhaps in support of Scrum or perhaps against, depending on how you feel about it. Now, there is an offhanded kind of remark in between a couple of hyphens, where I said thankfully in decline or something like that. I think I'm the one that added that comment. Um, and the kind of breakdown that I'm talking about that's in decline is where people go, okay, they've already broken it down in stories or PBIs to be like API. And then they're saying, okay, well, I'm going to spend this much time writing tests, and I'm going to spend this much time building it, and I'm going to spend this much time manually testing it. Like they've aligned it with their internal process. That's the stuff that I think I'm glad to see go. I saw that in the aughts a lot, and I didn't
But
see it
wouldn't
in the teens.
but wouldn't you see the checkboxes for something like that on the definition of done? We
Yeah,
finished the integration test, we updated the documentation, we recorded the demo, which means we're done with our
that's
work
right.
and
Yeah,
we
you'll
can
see all of
safely
that on the
close it.
definition done, but you won't. Hopefully, you won't see them say, "I'm going to spend 4.5 hours on this part of it, and I'm going to spend 30 minutes on this part, and I'm going to spend 9.14783 hours on the coding," like they like I saw in the aughts, right? That's the thing that I like that is in decline is these hours on, I'm going to spend a little bit of time typing this and a little bit of time typing that. That's the part that I don't
A-
think is.
And why do you think that's bad?
You don't necessarily know how long it's going to take, and by the time you don't, and it's not important. It's not important how long it's going to take you. Like, okay, so let's take breaking it down between writing tests and writing production code. Well, if your workflow is remotely modern, you know, that's an arbitrary distinction because you write a test, you write a little bit of production code, you write another test, you write a little bit of production code. That's how you implement a PBI. You don't write all the tests up front and then implement and then run all the tests and see if they pass. Right? You build in these little slices as you go with test driven development and proper refactoring and in between, and it's all mixed together. It's broken down to the point where hopefully you've already broken your work items down as more or less as far as you can anyway,
I
in terms
see.
of business terms.
I see. So basically, you're not against it as a principle, but you've seen it go overboard, like
Yeah.
taking this practice to the extremes where it's not buckets or areas, but instead it's almost like fine level
Internal
tasking at the
process, right?
micro
It's like,
level.
I'm also going to spend 45 minutes walking to the break room because it's this many days long, and I'm going to need to go to the bathroom, so I'll add a task for that, right? I mean, it's it's part of it's part of the work. That's the stuff I don't want to see broken down as tasks.
And
Gotcha, understood.
if you look at the examples that we have of definition of done in there, you can easily, and I think you just touched on that as well earlier, is that you can easily see that there's tasks in there. It's very clear, right? And quite often what we would do as a team, we'd sit down and say, okay, what are all of the things that actually need to get done? right? We need to do this, we need to do this. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I love when teams talk about that. I love it when teams have a clear understanding of what all the things are that need to be done in order for us to actually call this work item done. Because if you don't understand that, then how do you really understand how big it is and what, even if you're ready to take that on? Because some of the things that might need to be done, you might not be able to even be ready. You might not even be ready to commit to getting them done in a sprint because it depends on somebody else or it depends on some research or something like that. So there's absolutely no objection to teams using tasking or task identification as a means to understand what all the things are that you need to do. Right? It's this part of what I think what Max had said as well is this thing where a lot of that ends up being not process but kind of project management control, right? Because if you're a traditional project manager, you have to build out a Gantt chart. Well, guess what you need to know is you need to know exactly how many hours are estimated for every single task that you have in there, so you can track that to completion. Because without that, you can't do it, right? You need days, you need hours. If it's less than a day, etc. And so it's this attempt to try and manage it at that. And in the early days, a lot of my sprints with different teams where you would do kind of hourly burn down charts, right? And we would have the tasks that we've identified and we've estimated them, and we say, okay, this is how many hours we've now got and how are we tracking towards that in completion. It's another attempt to try and see how's that glide path, but it's a level of precision that so many developers have come back to me and said, you're asking us to provide an estimate and information that is completely unrealistic.
It's project management again, right? And project management in software, in my opinion, is like trying to storyboard a high jump, right? It's like she's gonna run and then she's gonna jump 57 feet or whatever, and then the crowd goes wild. Well, that's great. It's cool to put that on a storyboard. It doesn't change what's gonna happen, right? What's gonna happen is what's gonna happen.
Okay, so I want to switch gears a little bit, and I'd like you to describe ready in one sentence. Imagine you're speaking to CFO and you're trying to explain the readiness. What would you say? Why is that important? I guess let's start with you, Max. What do you think?
Look before you leap, right? You don't jump off a cliff without knowing what's at the bottom, right? You got to know what you're going to do before you start doing it. Probably the best way to describe it, not in one sentence, but my favorite response was one of our clients was talking about some resistance to this level of prefatory analysis, and he was talking with some people with the people who were resisting, and he listened to them all patiently, and then when they were done, he said, "Okay, so when did you want to figure out what we were supposed to build?" Right? Like, did you want us to build it and then figure out what we were supposed to build? Like, when is it that you wanted to find this out? Because it's not an option to not figure out what you want to do, right? The choice is, when do you want to do it? Do you want to do it before you build the software and build the right thing, like, and give yourself your best chance of success? Or do you want to, just scramble around and throw some money in a 55-gallon drum and light it on fire, and then figure out what you want to do and start
I
building?
like it. Do you want to figure out before you start, during the work, or after you're done?
Right. That's what it is, in my opinion.
Luniel, what about you?
I would say that it provides the intake and completion discipline that not only helps teams create flow in their work, but actually helps to create stability in that flow. I'll give you an example. An analogy would be if you, not software, but an analogy is cooking. One of the things that every single truly professional chef will tell you is absolutely a critical thing to do is, and I'm going to butcher the French term, but it's mise en place. And it is essentially, it's about getting all of your ingredients together and prepared before you actually start cooking your meal. Right? If you have your onions chopped, You're not going to come halfway through when something is ready for the onions, and now suddenly you have to go and grab the onion, peel it, and chop it and get ready, right, etc., etc. So this idea of doing the preparatory work so that you know that you can now start the task at hand, the thing that you need to do, and just do it smoothly, flow. There's a sense of calm that comes from that. You watch, I love watching very, very good, professional chefs do their thing, and you watch them do their work, and it's like, not only are they very skilled and they've internalized what they do and they're amazing at what they do, but there's a sense of calmness to it. They can cook these amazingly complex dishes, and there's no running with your hair on fire constantly to try and chase, oh, I forgot to do this, I forgot to do that, etc. Right? Now they make mistakes. They do that, but they don't panic in that. They just go and do their thing and they come back, they know how to recover. But for the most part, they have themselves set themselves up for success. That's what I mean with that statement, that one sentence that I gave you.
I hate that example because I have to think about it. After he said it a few times, every time I go to the refrigerator in the middle, I'm like, oh, forgot cheese, right? So I don't know what the hell I do it at all. Dude.
Well, I remember being a part of Six Sigma training, and the first thing they teach you in the yellow belt is they give you during the exercise Legos, and they tell each team to build something, some kind of a pattern off the Legos. And the lesson that you're supposed to gain out of it is put the pieces in front of you. I think that's about the same thing.
Yeah.
And we definitely know that works if you're prepared. And by the same token, my dad always taught me measure 7 times, cut once. It's kind of follows the same patterns, right?
Yeah.
These are logical messages that we've picked up in lots of different cultures. So last question, and I appreciate you guys spending so much time. If Scrum purists read your book, what's the one paragraph that you'd want them to really hear?
I guess if someone thinks they're a Scrum purist, because there's a lot of people who say they're Scrum purists, but they don't even know what Scrum is, right? So if we were talking to one of them, I'd like them to read, I don't know if this is too much, but the anti-pattern subsection from the Scrum is not the problem appendix. Because my guess is they'd go through that anti-pattern subsection and they'd see something that they think is a canonical part of Scrum, and it would trigger either a conversation or them going and reading the Scrum guide and adjusting their definition of what is and what is not Scrum.
What about you, Luniel? What do you think?
We might not have said it in one single paragraph, but for me, it's about understanding that Scrum is a framework, and it's a framework that doesn't contain every single thing that you need to have in order to succeed with software development. It's a framework that provides you with the structure that you need. And it's like and I think on page 256 we show a wooden frame of a house, right? Well, that frame is an essential piece for you to build the rest of the house on, and it's a fundamental part of it, but it's still a frame. And you use that to essentially add other pieces to it. And Scrum is Scrum literally talks about it as itself as a lightweight framework. And even though it came to fruition as a software development in the software development environment, it's not being used just for software development. And they didn't try to put every single practice in there. It doesn't talk anything about product management, doesn't talk anything about requirements or even requirements maturation, it doesn't tell you everything that you need to know to do software development and to succeed with it. So almost by necessity, you have to add things to it in order to succeed. Scrum on itself is not enough. And I want people to understand that it is okay to add things into your Scrum framework or add things on top of your Scrum framework, because you have to be able to ultimately succeed in what you are trying to use Scrum for.
Yeah, I agree. Scrum, it was not designed to have all of the practices. I would also disagree probably that it's a lightweight framework, but that's besides the point. Well, guys, thank you very much for your time. Really enjoyed the conversation. And for our audience watching, I will share the link to the book and to Luniel's and Max's LinkedIn profiles. They are a wealth of information. And if you have any questions, if you want to follow up with them, follow the rest of their writing or anything they do, you can do that. And again, I really recommend this book because once you read it, you will definitely not be able to think the same way about your software development process. So, Max, Luniel, thanks again. It was a real pleasure having you.